Everyone, it's 4 o'clock in New York. Voting is underway in New Hampshire, where the frontrunner is surging. The moderates are duking it out over electability. The former vice president is packing his bags for South Carolina, and one of the most talked about candidates in the Democratic primary isn't even on the ballot today. Today's Democratic primary in the Granite State has the potential to deliver Bernie Sanders a decisive win tonight. His final event last night before voting started was an electric, nearly 8,000-person rally. If he prevails tonight, it's a win that Sanders needs after Pete Buttigieg bested him for delegates in last week's Iowa caucuses. For his part, Mayor Pete is holding on to a second-place spot in the final polls leading into today, with some celebrity support of his own in the final hours of campaigning, and ripping into President Trump in a final appeal to voters about the stakes of today's race. The Real Clear Politics average of polls for New Hampshire shows Senator Amy Klobuchar, former Vice President Biden, and Senator Elizabeth Warren all bunched up together after the top two. Those are the closing arguments. We'll get to them in a little bit. But with Donald Trump encouraging his supporters last night to play in the Democratic primary by voting for the weakest candidate and aiming to jam the streets with a heavy Secret Service presence on the day of his visit, it's impossible to predict the behavior of Democratic primary voters looking at him as the alternative. In other words, expect the unexpected. The New Hampshire primary is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. On the ground in New Hampshire ahead of tonight's primary, my colleague, MSNBC host Katy Tur, NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard's back, and Axios political reporter Alexi McCammon. With us on set, Karine Jean-Pierre, Chief Public Affairs Officer from MoveOn.org, and former Republican Congressman, now for his health and all of ours, an independent, David Jolly. Katy Tur, my friend, let me start with you. Everything that I learned about the Iowa caucus voter and how they felt about their choices, I learned from listening to you interview them. So I'm dying to hear what you've learned about the New Hampshire primary voter, which includes, I think, one of the highest chunks of independents in the country.
Undeclared voters, and that is the largest voting bloc here in New Hampshire. And they're telling me a lot of the same things the Iowa voters told me, that they were making their decision at the last possible minute. I spoke to a few people today who said they either made their decision last night or they literally walked into the booth today, a booth like the one behind me, and picked who they were going to vote for in that moment. Voters here tell me they have a sense of paralysis because there are so many different candidates to choose from. A lot of people say their number one issue is electability, and what they're looking at is they're trying to find the candidate who they believe can stand up against Donald Trump. Joe Biden was making that case forever, but now that he's slipping in Iowa and he's slipping in New Hampshire right now, and who knows what's going to happen in Nevada or South Carolina, they're rethinking that choice. I'm hearing a lot of Amy Klobuchar. To give you a sense of where we are right now, and it's a lot different from Iowa because it's not a caucus. We're at a polling site, and I have to be careful about where I put the camera because we don't want to be accused of electioneering or getting involved in how people vote. But if you are an undeclared voter in New Hampshire, you can go here and you can check in, and then you can decide, I want to vote for a Democrat or I want to vote for a Republican. You do that here. You declare for a Democrat or Republican, either one you want. After you put your ballot in, and say you don't want to be a Republican or a Democrat, only 3 minutes is as long as you can be a Republican or a Democrat for. You come over here and you undeclare, and then you walk right out. And we're going to check to see if there's any lines out here, Nicole. So far, there is not. There's no line out here. And that is going to be an issue potentially, because what people want to see on the Democrat side is turnout. They really want to see higher turnout than what they saw in Iowa. So at this location, it's a little heavier than normal so far. We're in a bit of a dead time right now, 4 p.m. They expect it to get a little busier as the evening rush lets on. It's a small location, so the lines could be quite long outside of the block. And this is an interesting location because it's the most diverse. That's relative. It's the most diverse for New Hampshire. It's still 80% white, but there are some minority voters here, and it's a good place to figure out how exactly they're thinking. And it could be an indicator for what we might see going forward in the more diverse states that come up in the primary season.
Katy, if you can stay with us, we tried and failed, but I think we're going to try again to play some of Bernie Sanders' sound from his rally last night. I wonder if this closing message from Sanders, who's atop all of the polling I've seen in New Hampshire, is resonating. Let's listen and talk on the other side.
We are going to defeat the most dangerous president in the modern history of America, Donald Trump. The reason that we are going to win is the American people, no matter what their political views may be, are sick and tired of a president who is a pathological liar, who is running a corrupt administration, who is a bully and a vindictive person, who is a racist, a sexist, a xenophobe, a homophobe, and a religious bigot. And those are his nice qualities.
Bernie's going to tell us how he really feels about Donald Trump at a later point in time. Katie Tur, even from Bernie Sanders, a surprisingly harsh anti-Trump closer here for the New Hampshire voters. Katie.
Well, it depends. I mean, there are New Hampshire voters here who are really excited about Bernie Sanders, and they think that he's not divisive, and that they think that he's got good ideas, and they believe he's somebody who can accomplish those ideas. They're the diehard Bernie supporters. He won this state in 2016, but then there are those that look at him and say, I'm just not so sure about him. He kind of scares me. Those ideas are too big. I don't see how he can get them done with this Congress that we have, especially if the Republicans still control the Senate. They don't see it as plausible. But I want to talk to, we have a voter out here. Sir, you were watching, so you're going to be on television now. Can you tell us who you voted for?
Donald John Trump.
You voted for Donald John Trump?
Yeah.
Look at that. Bernie Sanders is not appealing to you?
The whole ideology would be destructive to the country. It's anti-growth. It's anti-family, it's anti-American, and as a Roman Catholic, it's anti-life.
Sir, thank you so much for telling us who you voted for. We appreciate it. Let's ask these other folks over here as well. Can you tell us who you voted for, sir?
No, I can't.
You cannot?
No.
You're keeping it a secret?
No, because I'm changing.
You're an election official.
I'm changing wards. I'm going to another ward to help them out.
Well, what about you guys?
Otherwise I would.
Thank you, sir, very much. Can you guys tell us who you voted for?
Of course not.
Of course not.
Because you're a celebrity doesn't mean you can get away with this.
I can't ask you who you're voting for?
Pick on the little guys.
Okay. Thank you, sir. New Hampshire voters, you don't have to tell me who you voted for. It's fine if you don't want to. We're going to see if the lines get a little bit bigger here later, Nicole. So far, a bit of a trickle.
Katie, I have a question for you. So you're reporting on the ground, but I think that what you just showed all of our viewers, anyone that's worked on a presidential campaign, I've worked on a few, has campaigned in Iowa, and they have campaigned in New Hampshire, and you just showed us the difference between those two states. In Iowa, they not only will tell you who their first choice is, they'll tell you who their second choice is, they'll tell you who their third choice is, they'll invite you over for dinner to sort of explain where they're coming from. In New Hampshire, they will not tell you which primary they vote. I mean, I will be surprised if people even indicate to you whether they walked in there and participated in the Democratic or Republican primary. New Hampshire voters keep it close to the vest, and it's why tonight will be exciting.
It kind of depends on where you are. Certainly in Bedford earlier, we got a lot of folks who were just really happy to tell us who they voted for and their process and how they came to that decision. But here in Nashua so far, I don't know, maybe if we see larger crowds later, maybe they didn't like my Iowa coverage. Maybe that's all it was.
You know what, Katie? Listen, it's not you, it's me. Stay with us, my friend. Vaughn Hilliard, I want to bring you in. You've been traveling with Pete Buttigieg. I want to show you his closing argument. We'll talk about it on the other side.
The totality of this presidency is one that has divided the country and has broken promise after promise to working people. And he's like the rooster who thinks he made the sun come up. Right now, we're still in a scramble. I mean, that's part of why we are going through this process, is to identify the messenger who can do the best job of conveying to the American people. It's not just about poking holes in Trump's fairy tales. It's about explaining where we're going next.
Vaughn Hilliard, Pete Buttigieg, one thing, whether you are a diehard Pete Buttigieg fan or open to him as the nominee or skeptical of him, he always makes his case to the voter about the future. And having worked on campaigns myself, that is often a winning closing message.
That has been his message. That was his message in those last 3 weeks of Iowa. And that Iowa, essentially that tie coming out of Iowa, validated it and allowed him to take it here. You know, he stopped into communities of a couple thousand, and he's gone from Manchester to Nashua. You know, Nashua is a town of 90,000, much like that of South Bend, Indiana. I was talking with one campaign official last night who said, look, you know, this may not be our backyard, but in a lot of ways, these communities, the kind of the grittiness of it is very representative of that of South Bend. And that's why they view this, even though, you know, this is Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders' backyard, that this is a place that they are optimistic about tonight. And, you know, about looking towards that future, it's the independence that he's trying to lure over, making it a welcoming party. He said, you know, it's sometimes hard for folks to even turn on the TV and listen. And he said, instead of moving away from the political system, open one's heart to potentially voting Democrat. And he said he is not running away from his position, whether it be his stance on abortion, his stance on, you know, gay rights. You know, this is a man who says that he is a liberal, he is a Democrat. At the same time, that doesn't mean that folks from the right can't be welcomed into this party at this moment in time.
You know, Vaughn, how does the Buttigieg campaign sort of put the Iowa effect into context in terms of these final polls? Sanders, clearly the front runner. Anything other than a decisive victory from him would be surprising. This is a state that he won overwhelmingly 4 years ago. Yeah. But Buttigieg moved into the second place slot after that, after winning the most delegates in those tumultuous and chaotic Iowa caucuses. Where do they put the Iowa impact in terms of their current standing in the polls, which is second, but they've got a strong pack sort of basically tied for third in Warren, Biden, and Klobuchar?
Iowa made them relevant here in New Hampshire. And that is exactly why the campaign officials are telling me that they want to propel themselves out of this state and put into voters' minds that this is a two-person race. Yes, Joe Biden, Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren may fare well here out of New Hampshire, but when it comes down to it, and you see Michael Bloomberg waiting in those Super Tuesday states, they want that Iowa victory and then a New Hampshire, either a victory or a near second place finish to validate their reasoning for being in this race. You know, you saw those numbers shoot up over the last week here by nearly 10 percentage points here in New Hampshire, and they contend that the exact same thing will take place in Nevada and South Carolina, especially communities of color. You know, you saw that Quinnipiac national poll that came out yesterday with among black voters nationally. Pete Buttigieg is still just at 4%, but the campaign contends that, you know, it's communities of colors that have the most to lose under another term of the Trump administration. And when folks realize that Pete Buttigieg is a real candidate, get to know him better, and realize that he has a true shot to not only win in the Midwest, but also a place like New Hampshire where Donald Trump lost by just 3,000 votes here 4 years ago, then they'll begin to take a more serious eye to him. Of course, he's been campaigning for more than a year, so there's a lot of work to do, though, over the next week or 2 weeks.
You know, I want to bring Alexi McCammon in on the Biden strategy. Biden expected to depart the state of New Hampshire before the results are known tonight. He has long pointed to South Carolina as the place where his appeal to a broader part of the Democratic electorate would be showcased. But I know from the failed campaigns of people like Rudy Giuliani, when your strategy is I will win later, sometimes you lose your momentum. You lose the electability argument, which was Joe Biden's central case to the Democratic base.
You know, he's facing a really uncomfortable truth in this race after Iowa, and now New Hampshire is looking just as bad for him as Iowa was, which is that voters are increasingly signaling in polling and in conversations with us here on the ground that they don't view Joe Biden as the most electable candidate right now. Yes, national polling shows that, but, you know, polling is not the same as what you're hearing from voters on the ground and seeing in these early voting states. I don't think that any presidential candidate who has done worse than second place in New Hampshire has gone on to become the nominee for their party, and that is another uncomfortable truth facing Joe Biden. The other uncomfortable truth facing Joe Biden is that, yes, he's departing early to go to South Carolina and really court black voters and make his closing argument to them, but so are a lot of other candidates and campaigns. Tom Steyer has been there this week campaigning. Instead of being in New Hampshire, he's also pumped millions of dollars into his campaign and his operation in South Carolina, and the polling is rewarding him with black voters there. Pete Buttigieg is making a stop in South Carolina between New Hampshire and Nevada, his campaign tells me. Simone Sanders, Joe Biden's campaign advisor, was in South Carolina yesterday, hitting the airwaves, canvassing with black voters and trying to get their last-minute support for him. But all these other folks are looking at Joe Biden falling and tumbling in the polls and in these early voting states, and they're no longer allowing him to have a monopoly on black voters in South Carolina because they're seeing the fact that voters increasingly don't view him as the best person to beat President Trump. There's a new Quinnipiac poll that shows that Michael Bloomberg is in third place in terms of electability, and that's something that's also got to worry the Biden campaign.
You know, Alexi, what's your theory on why it's Mike Bloomberg and not Amy Klobuchar or Elizabeth Warren who moved into that space? There's a vacuum, and we should just say there's a vacuum created by Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders seeming to have a real challenge, a real hard time making any headway with African-American voters. But instead of Amy Klobuchar, who seems to have some momentum there in New Hampshire, Elizabeth Warren, who's really run on paper a near perfect campaign. Why is it Bloomberg that's making inroads with the African-American voters?
Well, I will say one thing about the two women, Warren and Klobuchar, and that's that they're women. And I think that is another uncomfortable truth that we have to face as a country. We've never elected a female president in our history. We saw the criticism that Hillary Clinton got that was sexist in nature. We see the ways in which other female candidates this cycle alone have been treated and held to different standards. Michael Bloomberg, I think, based on the focus groups that we do with Obama-Trump voters around the country and Romney-Clinton swing voters and the folks that we talk to on the ground, even people in New York, you can sit down next to someone in New York or in, Wisconsin, and they can recite almost verbatim a Michael Bloomberg ad that they've seen on television. So to me, his rise in polling suggests that it's a rise in name ID. He's essentially bought name ID, and I think that that is what's being reflected in the polls. Maybe black voters and voters of all colors are learning Michael Bloomberg more and more of who he is, and they're responding well to that. Or maybe it's just that they think that they know more of who he is and that they think money is going to be what it takes to beat Donald Trump. Not someone like Joe Biden, who says he's gone toe-to-toe with Donald Trump, not someone who's trying to create a revolution and burn things down and build it back from the ground up, but someone who has a lot of money and resources and isn't afraid to use that in whatever way it would take to beat Donald Trump.
Corinne, I think the Bloomberg thing is also, they view Donald Trump as one of those like antibiotic resistant cold bugs that go around, and so they want something really strong. And I think they see in Bloomberg just some strong medicine. He's got limitless funds. He's got the audacity to say the kinds of things about Donald Trump that we all know bother him. And he's got a lot of people around him who know politics really, really, really well.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. Look, Donald Trump has made very clear that he's afraid of Bloomberg.
Right.
He's even given him a nickname and has talked about him on Twitter. Here's the problem. You can buy name ID. You can put ads up. And yes, your numbers are going to move up. But there's going to be some sort of ceiling at some point. And then you're going to be tested. And that's the thing. He hasn't been quite tested yet.
He's being tested today, though. There's some audio.
That's the first time that we have seen a little bit of a shake of like, okay, look, here's this audio of you. How are you going to respond? And hopefully soon he'll be on the debate stage. And that'll be
another. You want him on the debate stage, Corinne?
Look, I have to tell you, I did not agree with the way the DNC changed the rules after someone like Cory Booker and Julian Castro have been asking over and over for months, and that didn't happen. But now that it did, let's put Bloomberg on the stage. I think we need to see, can he hold up against the others? It's going to be a smaller field on that stage as we get closer to the next debate. So what can we do? Can he stand up? Can he make a contrast? How does he look on stage? And that is the thing. And look, he has 2,000 people across the country, millions of dollars going up on air. He is controlling the narrative right now, and not really. He's just taking on Donald Trump and nobody else. So let's see what happens when he's on that debate stage.
Who is most helped and who is most harmed by the Bloomberg fact? Bloomberg, the New Hampshire primary is underway, and here we are talking about Bloomberg again.
Well, look, Bloomberg, if he was a gambler, he put all his chips on Super Tuesday. And what he knows is in the first 4 primary states, there's 150 delegates, give or take. There's 1,400 available on Super Tuesday. Right. And the reality is campaigns now, particularly presidential campaigns, are a rich man's game. I mean, what Bernie's done with small dollar donors and others is what makes it a movement, if you will. But Bloomberg knows that he can go out and try to Sure, by name recognition, but he's also communicating with voters. I mean, voters are responding. It's not just that he's buying the nomination. We've seen billionaires try to do it before, and they don't have the response that Bloomberg does. What I think you're going to hear from Mayor Pete tonight, and Vaughn referred to it, Mayor Pete desperately wants to frame this as a two-person race.
Yeah.
Him and
well,
Sanders coming out of tonight.
he has a claim to that. I mean, he bested Bernie in Iowa in terms of delegates won. And so he right now is the only one who has come out on top in the single contest, as messy as it is.
But he wants to do it because he wants to prevent Bloomberg's narrative from taking hold, which is Bloomberg's the guy that can step in on Super Tuesday.
So here's the thing that we have to remember. These two contests are incredibly small. Less than
small and white.
Right, and I was going to say 90% white, more than 90% white. And if you think about it, less than 600,000 people are going to vote if you think about these first two. It is still early. I don't think we're going to have an answer after tonight. We're going to have more questions.
Yeah.
And, you know, you have to think about, okay, the more diverse states are coming up. They have to make their decisions as well. And so we are not there yet. We have a while to go.
We're going to do a whole hour on why Democrats allow these two states to be the first two in Democratic. In Democratic nominating contests, you cannot win. And it's not, I mean, we look at the polls for the African American vote the wrong way. It's not just how much of it you get, it's how much of it shows up on election day. It's not just how do they feel about you at the time a pollster calls, it's will they go out and vote for you? Because you don't win or lose on, I mean, compared to Donald Trump, I bet it's 100 to nothing. Close to it. But are they excited enough about you to turn out?
And that's a big test. That's another thing I'll be looking at tonight is turnout, right? Because turnout was so low in Iowa. Let's see what it is in New Hampshire. But you're right. Like, how are people going to react? We've seen some amazing turnout in the last 3 years. Are voters still engaged, and are they excited about your candidacy? Have you communicated in them in a way that they get excited? Which is why I'm really nervous about the Bloomberg thing. It's like he is.
I'm nervous about all of it.
I'm nervous because to say, you know, he hasn't been tested. Like, that is so important. At least you can say everybody else who played in Iowa, who played in New Hampshire, have been tested, and we see how people are reacting.
And I guess, you know, but they're screwing it. We have to get to a break, and I've got reporters freezing on the ground in New Hampshire. But I just have to say two things. I mean, one, I have never, and I've worked on a half a dozen campaigns, I have never seen something so unpredictable. And if any of my New Hampshire reporters want to jump in and dispute that notion, I welcome. And anyone seen anything this unpredictable? Katie Tur?
No. I mean, listen, it depends on who you talk to, I guess, when you're talking about unpredictability. I think the thing that I would just caution, as somebody who followed Trump in 2016, and I went to the rally last night, he got a lot of voters still turning up for him at this rally, 11,000. I did walk up and down the aisles and around the arena to try and find new voters, because the new voters are what he's going to need if Democrats have increased turnout in those very important states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. If Democrats can turn out more voters, then Donald Trump needs to find new voters. I only found 5. I found 5 voters out of the hundreds that I talked to. So he's going to need to find some new voters. But the Democrats need to find an inspirational message. They need to find a candidate that the party can rally behind, that can turn out not just the voters who voted in 2016, but the voters who might have stayed home in 2016, the ones who were not inspired by Hillary Clinton, and then potentially go and look for the voters who decided to vote for Donald Trump, having previously voted for Barack Obama. So when we talk about turnout at the primary, people are highly focused on it because they want to use it as a predictor going forward. But I will say this, primary voting with this many candidates and that paralysis that some of those voters feel, that can suppress turnout. It's not necessarily indicative of what will happen in November. A lot of voters say they're going to wait, to tell me at least, wait for the party to decide, and then they will vote for the Democratic nominee in November.
Katie Tur, I get to talk to you all night long. I'm coming back at 6 with Brian and Rachel, and I'm excited to talk to you all night long, my friend. I love it when you're out there. Katie, Vaughn, Alexi, thank you so much for spending some time with us. There is no better place to be on this day than on the ground in New Hampshire. We're following some truly stunning breaking news still developing by the minute this hour. 2 federal prosecutors in the Roger Stone criminal case have resigned this afternoon. This follows an astonishing decision by the Justice Department to pull back on its recommended sentence of 7 to 9 years prison time for Roger Stone. That original recommendation was part of a sentencing memorandum filed yesterday in D.C. and was apparently consistent with federal guidelines. Then came the Trump tweets. This one posted just before 2 a.m. this morning. Quote, "This is a horrible and very unfair situation. The real crimes were on the other side, as nothing happens to them. Cannot allow this miscarriage of justice." A few hours later, reports surfaced suggesting senior Justice Department officials would intervene to overrule the prosecutors in the Stone case. A senior DOJ official told NBC News the Stone sentencing recommendation was, quote, "extreme and excessive." One of the prosecutors who resigned this afternoon, Aaron Zelinsky, was also part of Robert Mueller's team. He'll leave Washington and return to his old post as a U.S. attorney in Maryland. Joining our conversation, former chief spokesman for the Justice Department, Matt Miller. Matt, this seems, for a Justice Department that under Attorney General Barr has done a lot of alarming things, from accusing the government of spying when they did nothing of the sort, from putting his finger on the scale and tainting the 2-year-long Mueller investigation. This feels like the most alarming reach into a criminal case, muddying up in the public wake of Donald Trump's desire, as articulated on Twitter, and doing something so offensive to 2 career prosecutors that they quit. They say, "I'm out."
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Nicole. You know, the department has really been poised, I think, on a knife's edge for 3 years. We've all watched as the president has tried to pull it in his direction and has tried to use it to go after his political opponents and reward his political allies. And the question has always been, what kind of department would we be? And we've seen at times when the department has stood up for the rule of law, and at times when they seem to cow to him, especially since Bill Barr took office. And I think when we ask that question, we've always wondered, looking from the outside, what would the warning signs be that the department has really gone off the rails? And if you had to come up with what all the warning signs would be, they're all staring us in the face today. This is as bad a thing as you could expect from the Justice Department. And the thing that really worries me, look, when you see the department make a filing like this, it would be unusual in any event for the department to pull back a filing after it's made it publicly, unless there's some changed circumstances. To do it after the president has weighed in the middle of the night is hugely inappropriate. And what especially concerns me is the people that are resigning. It's the career officials that are holding the line, and they shouldn't be the ones that have to hold the line. You should see the Attorney General resigning when the president wants to overturn a filing like this and pervert the rule of law. If the Attorney General doesn't resign, you should see the Deputy Attorney General resign. If he doesn't do it, it should be the U.S. Attorney. There's a new U.S. Attorney that's only been in that job 8 days. And what worries me is it's left to the career officials. And if they're gone, it means that it's going to be the U.S. Attorney and Bill Barr deciding what they want to do. And it seems clear all they want to do is the president's wishes, and that means to protect his political cronies.
Jeff Sessions wasn't really revered at the Justice Department, but he was, I think, begrudgingly respected for adhering to some norms, for going ahead and recusing when that was the recommendation from the Ethics Office. The guy who went in as the acting, I forget his name, Matt Whitaker, wasn't particularly respected and definitely wasn't revered. But to see Bill Barr go 1,000 layers deeper on the corruption of the department is shocking. And to think that he was someone who thought of people like Ted Olson as his peers, to see him debase himself in service of Donald Trump is stunning, even in the eyes of some of the Trump allies that I speak to, who are in his inner circle but not inside the government. Do you have any explanation for why Barr's doing this?
I think he believes it. I think he believes in Trump and Trumpism, and it is the brazenness of the situation. I think to put a word on what you're describing, that is so shocking here. Sessions and Whitaker weren't strong enough to do something like this, and they weren't bold enough to do something like this. And I think Sessions, at least for all his mistakes, had a little bit of integrity. He had some respect for the department's traditions. He was a longtime prosecutor before he became senator and before he became AG. I don't think he would have ever tried anything like this. But Bill Barr is just so brazen. We've seen this before. We saw it with the way he spun the Mueller report. We've seen it with the way they backed off the Flynn sentencing recommendation, where at first they were recommending jail time, and then after consultation with senior officials at the department, who we assume are the Attorney General, they backed off and said that probation would be appropriate. And it is so shocking because it's so brazen. It's like everything else the president does, and especially the way in the wake of his impeachment acquittal, they seem to not care anymore. Let's say that there was a good faith disagreement inside the department about what the sentence ought to be. That does happen. There are disagreements between prosecutors about what it ought to be. after the department has filed, you wouldn't in any case pull it back, but especially after the president's weighed in. Because if you do it after the president's weighed in, your action is so tainted because it looks so blatantly political to the outside. And the fact that they don't care about it, the fact that it's so obviously blatantly political and they're willing to do it anyway, says that they just don't care. They think they can get away with it with whatever they want in the same way the president thinks they can get away with whatever they want. And in a department that's supposed to be independent and is supposed to enforce the rule of law without fear or favor, without regard to politics, that is truly frightening. And I think it gives, it really puts a fine point on what's at stake in the election that I think this channel is going to be talking about for the rest of the night.
Do you think there's a tripwire, David Jelly, for Barr? Do you think if there, I mean, Frank Figliuzzi said on this program not to be surprised by an imminent pardon for Mike Flynn. You've got Stone getting ready to have his sentence reduced. You know, Manafort's in jail. I mean, it's amazing. I don't know anybody in jail. And Trump has a lot of friends in jail. Do you think that Republicans have a tripwire, or after looking the other way for abuse of power, there's, you know, they can just run amok?
No, they're all corrupt. Look, Bill Barr is as corrupt as his boss, Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is the person on the ballot, and he's every bit as responsible for what Bill Barr's doing as Bill Barr himself. And I think as Matt alluded to at the end, it's important that we look at this story in the context of the Democratic primary and the fact that there is an alternative, because Democrats are coming off a week where some commentators said, oh, you've got too many unpopular ideas. Bernie and Warren and others are being too progressive. It's not popular enough to win a general election. That's garbage. Because you know what's more unpopular? A president who's corrupting the Department of Justice, a president who uses his administration to put kids in cages, who says, I have a health care repeal plan but no replace plan, a tax cut that explodes the deficit. All of this, what we're seeing, this story today is absolutely within the context of what Democrats have to run on in November. Democrats, you know, I've said this, don't do this to yourself. Don't beat yourself up. Don't listen to the advice that you have unpopular ideas. You don't, because elections are about contrast. And whoever the nominee is, they're going to stand in stark contrast to the corruption of this administration and the failed policies of this administration. And we have to look at today's developments by Bill Barr within the context of the alternative that will be coming out of the Democratic primary shortly.
All right, Matt Miller, thank you for jumping in front of a camera for us when this story broke. We're grateful. After the break, Bloomberg facing the first real test of his candidacy on the issue of race, how he's trying to defend himself. That's next. All right, so we have that new audio we mentioned earlier in the show that has rocked Mike Bloomberg's 2020 candidacy. The mayor heard here defending the stop and frisk policy that he supported during his tenure as mayor. It's a policy that he denounced right before announcing his 2020 candidacy. Listen.
People say, oh my God, you are arresting kids for marijuana. They're all minorities. Yes, that's true. Why? Because we put all the cops in minority neighborhoods. Yes, that's true. Why do we do it? Because that's where all the crime is. And the way you get the guns out of the kids' hands is to throw them against the wall and frisk them.
We don't have enough time to go through all of that, but we will get to it. But let me give you the rest of the data points here. Trump, who had previously supported the stop and frisk policy, called Bloomberg a, quote, total racist in a tweet, but then deleted it a few minutes later. Bloomberg himself released a statement putting nearly all of the attention back on Trump. Here's part of the Bloomberg statement, quote, President Trump's deleted tweet is the latest example of his endless efforts to divide Americans. I inherited the police practice of stop and frisk, and as part of our effort to stop gun violence, it was overused. But this issue and my comments about it do not reflect my commitment to criminal justice reform and racial equality. In contrast, President Trump inherited a country marching towards greater equality and divided us with racist appeals and hateful rhetoric. Make no mistake, Mr. President, I am not afraid of you, and I will not let you bully me or anyone else in America. Joining our conversation now, Axios national political reporter Jonathan Swan, who spent some time with Mike Bloomberg lately, and joining us at the table, politics editor for The Root, Jason Johnson. Jason, let me start with you.
We knew this was coming. I mean, we knew this was coming. Mike Bloomberg's history of sort of racial invective and things that he said and sort of dressing it up in criminal justice has always been a problem. The question is going to be how much are voters, in particular black voters, willing to hold their nose if he turns out to be the strongest candidate coming out of this. And this won't be the only thing. Like I said, you know, When Will They See Us was like a hit documentary, and he stood against the exonerated five, getting any sort of recompense for what they went through. So I am not surprised by this. But again, I think the question remains, and this is important to remember, Notice how Mike Bloomberg spends this. Notice the people who he has supporting him. He's got a lot of black mayors who are going to come out on his behalf. He's going to say, hey, look, I made a mistake, but Donald Trump is worse, because that's essentially what his message is going to be. He has always been running on this idea that, look, I can do all the great economic things that Donald Trump did, but I'm not as much of a racist as he is. And we got to see if that's going to work.
And I wonder if all of the things you've been saying about sort of the pragmatism of the African-American vote that maybe isn't detected in the polling will come out as these things start to sort of come to light, that maybe light proves it's either going to be a disinfectant or a cyanide pill for him, right?
Well, and also it's a level of people's level of desperation. Look, I don't think people were supporting Mike Bloomberg not knowing about this. We all have relatives in Jersey. We have relatives in New York. People knew about this beforehand. Mike Bloomberg only exists as an entity, as a candidate, because of the stumblings and failings of other people. And trust me, if Joe Biden comes out and does a fantastic job in New Hampshire, you'll see Mike Bloomberg's numbers drop. You'll see black voters go back to him. If Bernie Sanders somehow does amazing in South Carolina, you may see black voters swift. You may see black voters sort of swift. But Bloomberg's success right now is purely based on the failings of others. And he's, again, this is just the beginning. He has so many other terrible things in his background, but we're going to see that when voters are desperate, when they feel they don't have any other options, they will hold their nose and vote for all sorts of terrible people. And I want to say this because this is key. Before we're cynical about where black voters are, and you see people online, well, it's just because of his money and this, that, or the other. We spent 3.5 years talking about why working class white voters voted for Donald Trump, who worked against their best interests. Let's spend that time looking at black voters, too. Let's spend that time finding out why black voters are voting someone who has been against them on so many levels, because that requires research as well.
Well, I mean, you correct me before I finish the sentence, but isn't it that the stakes are higher for African-American voters? I mean,
yes.
I mean, they're brown babies in cages, not white babies. We have a president who sees good people on both sides in Charlottesville and who has kind of winked and nodded at white nationalists.
At white nationalists and criminals.
Can I just add? It's fear and desperation.
Yeah.
I mean, black voters are looking at Donald Trump, and they, especially older black voters who are in their 60s and 70s, and they're like, this looks familiar. Or they look at Donald Trump and his policies. This is too scary for me.
I know that guy.
Yeah. I know that
Jonathan
guy.
Swan, one of the most interesting things to me today, I live in New York. I've followed Mike Bloomberg's campaign. I've known him as a Republican and independent and now a Democrat. And I admired his campaign's political acumen today. I think it takes some discipline not to get defensive when just tape leaking. Having worked on a campaign, you start, your pits sweat first, and then you get hot, and then you binge on candy, and then you go and try to figure out what to do. It's stressful when tape leaks. But this tape leaked, and they got a statement together, and they turned it right back around on Trump. They literally took the fire right back and pointed it right back at Trump, to the point where he did something he doesn't do very often, deleted a tweet.
I mean, that's true, and they just put out a statement saying, he was with more than 20 African-American faith leaders this morning, and they put out a statement. Jason's exactly right. Bloomberg has put a lot of energy into courting African-American leaders, particularly mayors. When I traveled with him through California last week, there were a number of African-American mayors traveling with him. Interestingly, one of them said that the first thing they needed to know before they supported him was that his conversion, his regret for stop and frisk was genuine, and that they accepted that. But look, here's what we're finding out with Bloomberg. He's been able to have the field to himself in terms of defining himself. He hasn't been roughed up yet. He hasn't had any oppo dumped on him. He's been able to define himself in the most pristine way possible, which is through squillions of dollars of paid advertising, largely uncompeted, because none of the other candidates can afford to compete in the states that he's, swamping with his advertising. Now we're starting to see the first hits coming. So it'll be interesting to see. He's put a lot of energy into this demographic, and we've seen his numbers start to rise in national polls with African Americans, and I think this is very risky for him. I will just add one other thing to what Jason was saying. One thing I observed, and look, this is anecdotal, and it's just from talking to voters when I travel with him just through one day in California, but one thing I heard, which surprised me, one thing I heard from a number of voters who turned up to his events was they like that he's rich. I was expecting, oh, he's a billionaire, it's terrible. I heard again and again, we need a really, really, really rich guy to beat Donald Trump.
Yes.
And I was interesting to hear that from pretty hardcore Democrat base voters.
So, Jonathan, I heard it from a Trump voter last night who said, I'm watching the debates, you know, and I'm curious about it, but none of them would pull me off of Trump except Bloomberg, because I don't have the fear that he would just, it's a small business owner. He said, I don't worry that he would destroy the economy. So for me, it's sort of a jump ball. Two rich guys, neither one of them would do any harm to the economy. And you know me a little bit, how can it be a jump ball? One is for, you know, anyway, babies in cages. I gave him my spiel. But anyway, it's not just Democrats. When you even have some Trump voters who say, you know, I like all the stuff Trump's doing for the economy, or they think they like what Trump says he's doing for the economy. We can debate whether or not that's real. But you have in Bloomberg this sort of interesting appeal of people, Democrats, as you're saying, who aren't offended by a billionaire, and Republicans who trust him with the economy.
I think that's true, although there's just such a large question mark, because it's very hard to assess these numbers that we're getting for Bloomberg. He hasn't been tested yet. He hasn't received the onslaught that Joe Biden has received. Trump hasn't spent any money against him. The other Democrats haven't had a chance on the debate stage because he hasn't been on the debate stage. So, look, he is doing well, and he's got endless amounts of money and endless amounts of staff. But I think this is the start of what will be a barrage against Bloomberg of all the things that Jason mentioned from his tenure as mayor.
Jonathan, we have you on because you have a great piece about the mayor from the day you spent with him on the campaign trail.
I thought it was my accent.
Well, we have you on for all sorts of reasons, but we don't get you all the time. And I just want to get you on the story we started with. Obviously, big primary tonight in New Hampshire. Any thoughts on for whom this matters most?
Look, obviously Bernie Sanders is in a great position, but I think I think this is do or die for Biden, in the sense that if he has a very, very disappointing finish, he's crawling at the moment. He's got no money. They've had to redivert resources and try and reframe 1,000 times that, you know, oh, Iowa, yeah, we're putting everything into Iowa, and actually Iowa doesn't matter. Now New Hampshire doesn't matter. Well, if he comes 4th or 5th, you know, this could be the end for Joe Biden, and we could see that firewall of support, African-American support, which is starting to weaken. We could see that really drip away.
Jonathan Swan, we're always grateful to have you. It's not just the accent, it's all your great reporting. Thanks for spending some time with us. When we come back, Biden's on his way to South Carolina. We're going to talk to a Biden advisor about everything we've been talking about all hour. His choice not to spend the night in New Hampshire is putting all of his cards on South Carolina, and whether that will work. Stay with us. All right, we're back with some breaking news about that developing situation at the Justice Department. A third prosecutor who worked on the Roger Stone case has resigned. His name is Adam Jed. So now 3 of the 4 prosecutors who were working on the Roger Stone case have resigned in the wake of Donald Trump tweeting. He's now holding forth in the Oval Office, I understand. We're not going to amplify that for him. This is a story we will keep an eye on all night long. Joining our conversation now, my friend of the show, Ron Klain, who serves as an advisor to the Biden campaign. A lot has been said this hour. I want to give you a chance to respond about your candidate's still deep and widespread appeal across the country, despite lowering of expectations on the campaign's part, both in Iowa, ahead of Iowa, and ahead of tonight.
Look, I think that, you know, he got in this for the reasons he believes he should be president, to take on Donald Trump directly, to try to repair the soul of the nation, to stand for the middle class, which has been forgotten. And that fight doesn't change. It doesn't matter, you know, how things come out in New Hampshire tonight. We're going on to Nevada. We're going on to South Carolina. He's always said the first 4 of these contests from all parts of the country, including the more diverse states of Nevada and South Carolina, are part of this. And until those voters are heard from, the race is just getting started. And so, you know, obviously, Nicole, we want to do better rather than worse tonight in New Hampshire, but whatever happens in New Hampshire, he is on to Nevada, he is on to South Carolina, and we're going to keep fighting hard.
Where would you put, the thought exercise is fine with me, because I think New Hampshire and Iowa do have really paltry numbers of minority voters who should be important in both parties, but play a larger role, sadly, in the Democratic nominating. Your hopes and aspirations for South Carolina?
Look, I think that we want to do very, very well in South Carolina.
Do you need to win South Carolina?
Well, I'm not going to sit here and put a mark on the wall right yet. Let's get the campaign going. Let's get everyone down there. Let's see what happens. I think the vice president, more importantly, will do well in South Carolina. Why? because I think his message about restoring the soul of the country, about standing up for the forgotten middle class, is going to resonate down there. We also know that obviously the African-American vote is a critical vote in South Carolina. Vice President Biden has strong support in that community, and I think it's a chance for those voters to be heard that obviously did not exist in Iowa and does not exist in New Hampshire.
What do you feel like Pete Buttigieg represents a threat maybe the campaign wasn't prepared for?
Well, I think it's it's a crowded field of very talented candidates, of very, very strong candidates. Mayor Buttigieg is one of those. He's not the only one, of course. And so, this isn't about which one of these people is a threat to Joe Biden. None of them are a threat to Joe Biden. They're all a threat to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But the question is, who's the best person to take on Donald Trump? That is still Joe Biden. That's what the polls still show. In those swing states of Michigan and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida, Joe Biden is the Democrats' best chance to win, and the Democrats' best chance to win the Senate. If Democrats really want change on health care, change on climate change, we have to take the Senate. Joe Biden's our best opportunity at the top of the ticket to deliver on that.
Ron Klain, I want to ask you two things. One, no matter what happens tonight, please come back tomorrow. And two, for all of the Biden supporters who were so angry at the media for sort of covering the polls, what do you say? You've sort of seen the media from both sides in and out. What's your message to the Biden supporter tonight?
Like my message is, this is about who Joe Biden is fighting for. And he is fighting for the same people he got in this race to fight for. And so I think if that resonates with you, if you're one of those voters he's speaking to when he says we need to restore the soul of America, when he says we need to stand up for the forgotten backbone of this country, then, stand tough and come out in Nevada, come out in South Carolina, help us win there.
Ron Klain, please come back tomorrow, and good luck tonight to your candidate. Thanks for spending some time with us. We're going to sneak in our very last break. We'll be right back.